Buenas tardes. Bien, en primeras palabras tienen que ser de agradecimiento a Casa de la India, en especial a Guillermo Rodríguez por esta invitación, por el privilegio que representa y por la confianza en mis capacidades, para presentar nada menos que a William Dalrymple, una figura realmente excepcional. Es una figura ante todo polifacética, es un viajero, un escritor, un fotógrafo, un especialista en arte, historiador, analista, creador de documentales y de iniciativas de la magnitud de esta en la que estamos en este momento. El reconocimiento que ha recibido es amplísimo, tanto en todo tipo de distinciones, desde doctorados honoris causa, invitaciones a todas las universidades y sobre todo de la atención que ha recibido por el público, que supongo que es lo más importante para un escritor. Cargado de premios, por una parte, traducido a más de 40 idiomas, autor de toda clase de libros, reportajes, exposiciones, iniciativas, etc. Pero ante todo es un viajero y un escritor de obras de viaje. El origen, su primera obra, su primer libro, en Xanadu, es un viaje tremendo, un viaje que repite el de Marco Polo en busca de la capital de Kublai Khan, en Xanadu, que recorre miles de kilómetros para ir al otro lado del mundo. Y es un libro de viajes que tiene lo que a mi juicio tienen los buenos libros de viajes. No por lo que me cuenta de lo que yo no conozco, no por lo que me cuenta de paisajes maravillosos, de monumentos extraordinarios, de costumbres fascinantes, sino por lo que me cuenta de lo que yo conozco de un viaje, de su cotidianidad, es decir, de los momentos difíciles, de los momentos incluso de desesperación y del mucho aburrimiento que hay en cualquier viaje. Eso me hace sentir que yo viajo con él, es decir, que no simplemente me está contando todas esas bellezas y contándomelas tan bien como él las cuenta, sino que me lleva conmigo y me hace viajar con él. El encuentro con la India es inmediatamente posterior, en ese viaje gigantesco hasta el extremo, hasta China, hasta la Mongolia interior. Deja de lado la India, pero vuelve a la India para escribir su siguiente libro, su libro sobre una ciudad, Delhi, una ciudad marcada por las cicatrices de la historia y que va a ser el origen de su relación intensa, absoluta, prácticamente con la India. No solo la India, sino todo el subcontinente asiático, incluido Afganistán. A partir de ahí va a escribir toda una serie de obras muy diversas, unas vinculadas a la actualidad, como la época de Kali, otras orientadas a la historia, como la dedicada al último emperador mogol, a la primera guerra de Afganistán, al surgimiento de la East Indian Company, y dentro de eso van a destacar una serie de temas. Ante todo, ya ha aparecido en los títulos que acabo de señalar, los conflictos de todo tipo, políticos, religiosos, sociales, coloniales, etc. En segundo lugar, las paradojas de la modernidad, cómo esa modernidad produce en la India toda clase de paradojas que estudia con un sentido del humor extraordinario. En tercer lugar, el arte. El arte es uno de sus terrenos y va a poner de manifiesto en todos sus trabajos su sensibilidad para la arquitectura, su capacidad para explicarla y para contarla. Y por último, yo destacaría entre esos temas la espiritualidad. En un libro fascinante que les recomiendo a todos ustedes, ante todo, titulado 9 vidas, ¿no? La búsqueda de lo sagrado en la India moderna, donde sigue a 9 personajes extraordinarios que van desde una monja jainista que está practicando el suicidio por ayuno hasta elementos tántricos que practican el sexo tántrico, un cantante ciego, toda una serie de personajes, cada uno de los cuales es un mundo, y él lo describe de forma extraordinaria. En su trabajo destaca sobre todo el rigor como investigador, tanto en sus obras históricas como en sus reportajes, su sensibilidad frente a la miseria y frente a la desdicha, la capacidad para adivinar la grandeza moral que encierran. En tercer lugar, la capacidad para captar la nostalgia de la decadencia producida por la historia y los mundos que va destruyendo y al mismo tiempo la belleza que todo aquello produce. y además un olfato sorprendente para los temas, es decir, encuentra temas poco atendidos hasta ese momento y que tienen un potencial extraordinario. Por ejemplo, la etapa de decadencia de los mogoles, no la etapa de la que hoy va a hablar, de Akbar, Fatehpur Sikri, etcétera, sino justamente el momento de decadencia ya a finales del siglo XVIII y en el siglo XIX, lo que dará origen al último emperador mogol, o uno de sus libros más fascinantes, la historia de un agente doble, de un agente de la East Indian Company que sin embargo es seducido por la India, se casa con una india, adopta las costumbres indias y da lugar a uno de sus libros más exitosos, y además el que dio lugar a un reportaje de televisión extraordinario. Y sobre todo eso, la capacidad reflexiva, la capacidad para verse a sí mismo dentro del viaje, para verse a sí mismo como otro, también como otro. Y finalmente, quiero aprovechar que tengo aquí a Dalrymple y hablar de qué es la condición de viajero, porque hay pocos viajeros en el mundo con las características que él tenga. Yo creo, y eso se ha dicho muchas veces, que el viajero es lo contrario del turista. Turista, que viene de tour, en francés vuelta, es el que va para volver. Y el que trata de acumular experiencias, ¿no? Mientras que al viajero le mueve el impulso hacia adelante, el impulso a conocer, que en última instancia es siempre el deseo de descubrirse a sí mismo. Esa pulsión del viaje es fundamentalmente la pulsión de la aventura entendida del modo radical que se entiende en los romances medievales y que expresa para mí sobre todo un momento de la Vulgata artúrica, cuando los caballeros salen a la aventura y uno que es novato le pregunta a Lancelot, a uno de los más expertos, ¿y qué es eso de la aventura? Y le contesta, si supiéramos qué es, no sería una aventura. De eso se trata, justamente, de ese impulso hacia adelante, que recoge sobre todo uno de los cuartetos de T.S. Eliot, el tercer cuarteto, su tercer movimiento, que justamente está dedicado a analizar la Bhagavad Gita, que habla del río como el impulso fundamental que nos impulsa, y que termina con los dos versos maravillosos de no feliz viaje, sino adelante, viajeros. William, te toca.
First of all, thank you so much for that wonderful and generous introduction. It's a huge honor to be here. Ambassador, thank you for gracing us. My wonderful co-director, Navata, one of India's most distinguished writers. Her first book has just been released as a Penguin Classic, which is a great sort of mark of distinction. Vikas in the front row, whose wonderful books have been transformed into some of the great movies of recent times, and Shekhar, who has made some of the greatest movies of the recent times. So I'm very honoured to be in this group. The last time I came past Valladolid, I was on foot on the Camino when I was 21, had more hair, less stomach, and was walking on my way to Santiago, and went to Santo Domingo de Silos, which I'm hoping to go and see again tomorrow, one of my favorite places on that pilgrimage, and with some of the most beautiful Romanesque sculpture anywhere. And so I have very, very happy memories of passing here very slowly last time, in contrast to the high-speed chase from Madrid to get here to speak today after a shocking 2-hour immigration queue. So I blame entirely on my hideous Brexit politicians who tore Britain out of the wonderful EU, and I sat for 2 hours watching the empty EU immigration queues, dreaming of how things used to be before the moronic right-wingers who took over my country have destroyed Britain's place in Europe, something which has impoverished us and reduced us intellectually, and it's so good to be back within Europe and seeing Europe open to India here today. I'm very excited to talk today about the Great Mughals, which is a subject which is a matter of great debate at the moment in India. And I think the Spanish, of all the peoples in Europe, can appreciate the complexities and nuances of this debate, because both Spain and India were countries which had high cultures and great civilizations before the arrival of Islam, and attitudes to Islam within those two countries and how Islam reacted in those countries look very different depending on the different peepholes that you look through. From one angle, which was the angle very much taken by Nehruvian scholars in the early days of independent India, the Muslims produced an extraordinary extra layer, a whole new warp and woof into the tapestry that is the richly diverse cultures and civilizations of India. There are those today in government who point equally often with strong historical backing to stories of temple demolition, of the killing of holy men from another faith, and so on. And I think in Spain you have a similar debate, and I'm very interested to hear from the audience, because the idea of the Convivencia, the idea of living together in al-Andalus is an issue which is open to debate, and historians on the right and on the left look at it differently. I think I'm not the right person to draw the parallels. I don't know the situation here well enough to compare it. But I think there are strong parallels and as well as differences. I'd be interested to hear from the audience how much they see similarity and difference in what I'm about to talk about, the Mughals in India. The Mughals are important in Indian history because, unlike the history of China, where China was for most of the last 3,000 years one united state with periods of warring states and division in between, India is actually the opposite. It is a region with incredibly strong unitary culture and a strong geographical and cultural identity, but one which for most of history has been ruled from many different places, fractured into different polities. And the periods when India has been largely united are the exceptions rather than rule. The period of the Emperor Akbar, who ruled a state very different from the shape of today's India, in that it went far into Afghanistan, but didn't reach the far south. The Guptas, who conquered the whole of central India and the Gangetic Plain, but didn't reach up to Afghanistan nor to the south. The Mughals, who we're going to talk about today, who very nearly conquered the whole of India, but again, not the far south, but also conquered not only Afghanistan, but what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh. And then there is the British period, when under colonial rule, for better or worse, and many would say for much worse, India was again pulled into a single unitary state, only to be shattered in partition in 1947. So the Mughal period is one of those periods when India is united. It's also one of those periods and rare periods when India is richer than China. Ming China is very rich. The porcelain trade and so on brings enormous wealth to China. But Mughal India is even richer. 40% of the world's GDP is created by Mughal India at a time where my own country, Britain, was producing less than 6% of the world's GDP. And while we're going to be talking today mainly about the literary and the cultural and particularly the architectural and artistic achievements of the Mughals, it's important to remember that these came out of incredible economic success. When Bollywood presents the Mughals, you see the Taj Mahal, you see the beautiful women and the harem. What you don't see is the 1 million looms churning away in Bengal, producing the greatest textiles in the world. But like any golden age of history, it is based on a super strong economy. And it is in textiles and the production of cotton, simple white cotton, that is the best quality in the world, that is exported with such success in times to come by the East India Company, that there will be deindustrialization in Mexico in the 18th century due to the sheer input of Indian imports. But also fancier textiles, kalamkaris, silks, beautiful embroideries of a million different varieties, which are still one of India's great strengths and cultural markers. The rich textile and fashion world is something that is just as strong today as ever. But in the Mughals, that reaches a peak. And you have a strong unitary state that spreads right up to Kabul in the north, down to Hyderabad in the middle south, from Dhaka and the borders of Burma in the east to the frontier with Iran in the west. It's a vast, vast area. Is ruled with great efficiency and some brutality. It also has an unusually high rate of tax, particularly in rural areas. So there is some basis for the view that the Mughals were foreigners who came and taxed to a very severe degree the people who lived there. But of the cultural achievements of the Mughals that I'm going to be talking about today, that I will be addressing, and this begins with this extraordinary figure, Babur. Unexpected, in a sense, for this man to be a great aesthete and a great writer, because he has in his veins the blood of not one but two of the world's most brutal conquerors, both Genghis Khan on his mother's side and Timur on his father's side. But like many brutal empires, periods of conquest and violence give way to periods of learning, of writing, of the arts, and of building. And Babur is born in what's now Uzbekistan, on the banks of the Oxus, and is coming at a period when the brutal conquests of Timur have given way to far more pleasure-loving, aesthetically aware, richly intellectual world. The uncle of Babur was one of Central Asia's greatest astronomers, who set up an extraordinary observatory in Samarkand that uncovered whole new areas of the galaxy which previous worlds had not known. There are, at the same time, extraordinary building programs, but Babur leaves something even more personal and tangible, which is one of the world's greatest autobiographies, the Baburnama. Babur wrote a diary with extraordinary frankness and with extraordinary beauty and an extraordinary ability to bring a world to life. It's incredibly honest. It's not clear whether he imagined that everyone else would be reading it after him, because he writes, for example, about falling in love with both men and women, not something you'd expect a Islamic ruler to go into detail about. In fact, he says specifically the time he fell most in love was with a boy in the bazaars of Herat, a boy of humble origin, who he became obsessed about. He talks about food, about cooking. He talks about how when he goes to visit his sophisticated cousins in Herat, which was then on the borders of Iran and Afghanistan, was one of the most rich cultural centers of Central Asia, he was embarrassed that he didn't know how to eat a duck. And all his cousins seemed to be very au fait with how to cut the duck up and eat the delicacies and what bits to leave and what to do with the beak and this sort of thing. And Babur is aware that he's the provincial among these sophisticated people, and writes about that. He writes about drinking parties, again surprising for someone who is seen in India primarily as a sort of jihadi. He talks about experimenting with different kinds of drink and compares it to experimenting with opium and other drugs, and indeed taking the two together and doing so on a boat and the consequences of that. And this book goes on and on about this with a frankness that few other diaries possess, but all the more extraordinary that a ruler should write this, and a ruler who changes history. Because it's Babur's fate to come at the end of this Timurid period, and when he's in it, he first captures Samarkand when he's only 16 years old, and then loses it when he's 17. By the age of 21, he's been defeated in battle by the Uzbeks, who, of course, turn that area of Central Asia into what we now call Uzbekistan. And he's driven out, and even more humiliating for him, in order to get a safe exit for his tribe, he has to give over his sister in marriage to his enemy. This is a considerable humiliation and sacrifice. He's always worried about his sister, but she takes this on as something she does to get the rest of her clan safely into Afghanistan. He then remakes himself in Afghanistan. He turns Kabul into a great cultural center. And then, fatefully, one of the Afghan tribes who have already conquered Delhi ask for him to intervene in their squabbles, and they want his military help. And in order to lure him, a jar of honey with marinated green mangoes is sent to Babur in Kabul, and it is the green mangoes and honey that makes him decide to try and conquer India. And he's lucky because at this point there have been considerable advances in artillery techniques in Central Asia, and the Lodis, the Afghans who then ruled Delhi, because Delhi had been already ruled by a succession of sultanates for the previous 250, 300 years. He goes down the Khyber passes as many, many invaders had before him, and thanks to his firearms technology, he wins the Battle of Panipat and takes over in India, and only makes a start because he dies soon after, handing over to Humayun, his son. And Humayun is this, like many people who have military fathers, I'm looking at Sanjoy here, often the children of military men end up dabbling in the arts and often lead more rackety lives than their disciplined fathers. And this is certainly the case with Humayun, who is basically a sort of hippie, who was incredibly silly at times. When his father wanted to invade India, the whole invasion is delayed 3 months because Humayun's gone off hunting and doesn't come back in time, and so they have to invade in the middle of the summer in May, which is the worst possible time to be wandering around the plains of North India, as we saw only last month. It's incredibly hot and not a time to fight a military campaign, particularly if you're wearing armor. But that's all Humayun's fault. Humayun then manages to lose the kingdom, and on his way out, all he saves is a bag full of enormous jewels, one of which may have been the Koh-i-Noor diamond. He then goes to the loo by a riverbank, and in the process of cleaning up afterwards, leaves the jewels by the riverbank, and rides a mile away before a page runs up and says, "Humayun, Humayun, I think you've left these." And inside is the purse, which is of all the things, everything, the only things he's managed to retain from India. And with these jewels, he negotiates an alliance with the Persian emperor, and eventually, 10 years later, manages to come back into India, only to smoke too much hash or drink too much opium and fall down a flight of stairs in his library while he's busy doing a horoscope. And so he's this sort of hippy-dippy, hopeless character. It turns out actually a much more important scholar than we'd all realized in matters of astronomy. Today we regard astronomy, which is sort of telescopes and NASA, as quite a different science to astrology, which is horoscopes and auspicious days for weddings and this sort of thing. But at the time, both in Europe and in Asia, and specifically in India, it's one science in India called Jyotishya, which was studied together. And India had a reputation as the greatest country for this art, for being able to read in the heavens auguries of what's going to come on Earth. So Humayun's fascinated by this and loses himself and is constantly sort of shooting arrows into the air and seeing which one comes down where and this sort of thing. Anyway, dies, leaving his son Akbar in charge. And Akbar's life is divided into two halves. The first half is trying to sort of clear up the mess his father's made, reconquering the regions that Babur had held and Humayun had lost, and then expanding it. But he soon realizes that it's a completely different thing to rule India, where Hinduism had never died out and remained, despite 300 years of Islamic rule, the majority faith. And an incredibly strong faith, which still had a rich cultural life, which he was very interested in. And so he makes the decision that he will, having conquered several Rajput tribes in Rajasthan, he will create an alliance with them, and it will be a joint Rajput-Mughal enterprise that takes this forward. This is a matter of some embarrassment to the Rajputs today, who often deny it, but this is historical fact. There is much intermarriage between the royal houses of Rajasthan and the Mughal royal house, so that subsequent generations of emperors are half, three-quarters, even 9/10 by the end, Rajput, rather than from Central Asia. And you can see this in their features. Akbar still has the slightly Central Asian feature of someone of Mongol descent, but by the time his son is born, Jahangir, he looks just like anyone would look in Jodhpur or Jaipur. But what is extraordinary about Akbar are his experiments with religious faith. At a time when in my country, Queen Elizabeth was hanging, drawing, and quartering Catholics, persecuting the Jesuits, seeking out Catholics and hanging them and exiling them for their faith. At a time here, when Isabella Catholicos and so on were producing the Inquisition to track down conversos and those who had, in their view, not adopted the Christian faith to all its fullness. At that time, Akbar has religious discussions and brings together different kinds of Hindu sects, different kinds of Muslims and Sufis, Jews from Cochin, some of whom had started in al-Andalus and been driven out, reaching now into India. Some of the greatest intellectuals in early Portuguese Goa we're running out of time, are Jews who'd fled from Lisbon and ended up via Portugal arriving in Goa. And one of the pioneering geologists of India is such a man. And you can see these religious discussion groups here. There are two Jesuits from Goa on the left, along with other holy men. And it's during the reign of Akbar that we see the great Hindu epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, particularly the Gita, being translated into Persian and being illustrated, and the growth of a hybrid Mughal school of art, which takes much from the sculpture and painting of the previous Hindu civilizations and cross-fertilizes it with Persian techniques brought from Afghanistan and Persia, resulting in this beautiful hybrid style. Here we have the story of Krishna in Vrindavan raising up the mountain to shelter his cowherds and villagers from the rain. And the iconography looks back to earlier Hindu sculpture, but the style of the painting derives from Persian techniques. So what you see in this reign is not only politically alliances, but artistic coming together too. And the story of Mughal rule is the story of that alliance lasting as long as the Mughals are tolerant and give the Rajputs and the other Hindus their share of the cake. Today, if you want to look at the miniatures from the Deccan courts, the courts which were conquered by the Mughals in the middle of India, you have to go to places like Bikaner and Jaipur to see them, because they got the loot from sacking those cities. And those, the greatest masterpieces from those Muslim civilizations are now in Hindu courts in Rajasthan. And scholars today have to go to Bikaner if you want to study, for example, the art of Ahmednagar in the Deccan. The jizya tax, which is a feature of life in al-Andalus as well as in India, the tax on non-Muslims, the dhimmi, is abrogated by Akbar. It ends under his rule. And the most dramatic side is what happens to the House of Jaipur. And the different princes of Jaipur are not only intermarried with the Mughal court, they are put in charge of the Mughal army. A man who had been the enemy in battle is given the army to command. It's an extraordinary and unique gesture. I can't think of another gesture like that anywhere in world history, where you turn to your enemy and tell him to lead your army and become your general. And there's a measure of the complexities of this when you go to one of the great forts of Bihar, Rajgir, built by one of the Jaipur princes as governor of Bihar. That's eastern India. And there are two inscriptions. One is in Persian, which the Mughals could read, and it says, Jai Singh, the humble servant of the Mughal Emperor, whose reign will last 1,000 years, who is the greatest man alive, who is this, that, and the other. Then there's another inscription beside it, put up at the same time in Sanskrit, which Man Singh clearly assumed the Mughals couldn't read, which says, Man Singh, the greatest guy ever, the big man in battle, the champion of Eastern India. And these two still stand there together. And so you get a measure of how these things were being negotiated on a human level at this time, and the different ways that people were explaining these things. Akbar becomes a vegetarian. He says that he criticizes meat eaters for having converted their inner sides, where reside the mysteries of divinity, into a burial ground of animals. And then he has this long struggle for a son. He does all these barefoot pilgrimages, like the Camino de Santiago. He walks, in his case, from Ajmer to Sikri in south of Agra, west of Agra, and stays with this family of Sufis. And in due course, his wife does conceive, and in this place, in the center of Mughal Fatehpur Sikri, a son is born, and he is called Jahangir. But what is interesting is that over the main gateway of the mosque, he puts an inscription about Jesus Christ. It says, Jesus, son of Mary, on whom be peace, said, the world is a bridge. Do not build your house over it, but walk over it in peace. Now, what's interesting about that inscription is that that phrase appears nowhere in the Bible, but it does appear in the Islamic sayings of Jesus, some of which are derived from what we now call the apocryphal Gospels. There was a thing in the paper yesterday about a newly discovered manuscript in Egypt of the infancy narrative of Thomas. Now, the infancy narrative of Thomas contains some of the Sufi stories that end up being carved onto Mughal manuscripts. And so you get, in other words, Christian traditions lost in Western Christendom, which are preserved by Muslims in India, which is a complicated and fascinating thought. Just to race through, that's where the inscription is, above the main gateway in Fatehpur Sikri, not where you would, the main gateway to the main mosque of the empire, you find an inscription about Jesus and Mary, an extraordinary moment in history. And this is the making of Fatehpur Sikri. It was built like a sort of IKEA kit, so as not to disturb the women of the harem. It was made elsewhere, then just fitted together with a sort of complicated map that no one, you never have the right nuts to do it with, or the. And this is the room where the religious discussion groups took place. It's thought that Akbar sat above this extraordinary pillar with the holy men of different religions sitting in these axial corridors, giving their different views. Extraordinarily beautiful buildings. This is the young Jahangir. Jahangir goes to Allahabad, Prayag, and there he also continues his father's interest in Hinduism and writes the first yoga manual, the oldest yoga manual to survive in any religion. Written in Persian, but derived from interviews with the sadhus sitting at the confluence, the Sangam of the Yamuna and the Ganga. And during the reign of Jahangir and Shah Jahan, you get an increasingly strange selection of Mughal miniatures dealing with the Hindu gods and goddesses, explaining to these foreigners who are now intermarried and living in this country the complexities and the philosophical nuances of this great faith. Jahangir has the great advantage of having a strong and brilliant wife, Nur Jahan, who is a great shot from a howdah, seen on the right. And it is those two who build for her father, Itmad-ud-Dawla, this beautiful tomb, which is the first time the Mughals discover marble as a substance. And here they develop a new style of inlaid marble that reaches its apogee, of course, later in the much more famous, winding forward quickly, riverside situation of the Taj Mahal, which is built in the 1640s and still has the ability to take one's breath away. For my money, the most beautiful building in the world. It's a boring thing to choose the obvious building as your favorite building, and yet it has to be. It is just astonishingly lovely. And we've run out of time, but just to bring it through to a conclusion, this alliance of Hinduism and Islam, brought together politically, artistically, and culturally of the Mughals, breaks down when the Emperor Aurangzeb abrogates that treaty. He reimposes jizya on the Hindus. There is a Hindu reaction. Particularly a great warrior named Shivaji rises up above Bombay, reconquers the heartlands, and creates a vacuum that's eventually filled, bizarrely, not by Hindus or Muslims, but by a Western trading company, a corporation, the East India Company. But that's another story for another day.
¿Se oye? Sí. Tenemos 5 minutos para preguntar a William. Yo tengo una pregunta, por si mientras van pensando ustedes las suyas. Lo que nos has hablado es de historia. La historia es un mecanismo de producir identidades. Es una historia muy hermosa, la de los grandes mogoles, con obras como Fatehpur Sikri, Taj Mahal, etc. Pero hoy en día, ¿quién se identifica con los grandes mogoles? ¿Pakistán o la India? ¿Quién asume todo lo que representa fundamentalmente Akbar, pero en general los grandes mogoles? Sí, los pakistaníes o los indios. O los indios de la India, quiero decir. Esa sería mi pregunta, mientras van pensando ustedes la suya.
So the answer was, until 20 years ago, about 20 years ago was both Pakistan and India claimed these extraordinary buildings and this great culture as their own. Thank you, Nia. But they highlighted different bits. Pakistan turned Aurangzeb, the jihadi, if you like, the severe Muslim who lived by the strict Sharia law, into their hero, while the Nehruvian-era historians of India chose Akbar, who, for my mind, is the most extraordinary and the most admirable, too. But there's no question that that has changed in the last 20 years, and the current Hindu government, the current Hindu nationalist government, the BJP, have risen to power partly by targeting the Muslims and Muslim history as something foreign, as invaders coming from outside, not of India, different from India. And while the old Nehruvian historians emphasized the period of Akbar, when Hindu texts are translated, when Hindu armies are fighting alongside Muslim armies against other enemies, the BJP emphasizes that this is not a Hindu culture, that is not native to India, it is something foreign and something which should be subject to a Hindu rule, Hindu Rashtra. And that debate goes on. At the moment, when you go to the National Museum in Delhi, there are almost no Mughal artifacts on show there. There are a few miniatures in the painting section, but every year they're fewer and fewer. There was a Mughal museum in the Red Fort. It was taken down for cleaning and then never re-erected. And this remains an unresolved issue. There is a strong popular mood at the moment that that goes with the right-wing government, that the Mughals are seen as foreign. And I suspect that there's been similar moments maybe in Spanish history when the Muslims have come to be seen by some, maybe on the left, as part of Spanish history, and others possibly on the right as foreigners who've driven out the Reconquista. You can tell me better than I can, but there are certainly parallels, I imagine, in how do you deal with a high culture, wonderful enough to have built the Alhambra and the Taj Mahal, but which is from somewhere else, and which is coming in, conquering, occupying, and then is defeated. In that sense, it would be very interesting to compare the attitudes to the two, but I'm not sufficiently well versed enough in Spanish history to do so.
Gracias. Desde luego, en la historia española, en la Edad Media, no hay, que yo recuerde ahora, nadie similar a Akbar. No hay ni un dispositivo como el que hay en Fatehpur Sikri para dialogar, ni nada de esto. Pero es muy interesante lo que me dices del cambio con el BJP BJP en la India. Bueno, esa era mi pregunta. Su turno. Tienen la oportunidad de hablar con uno de los viajeros más fascinantes que yo conozca y de preguntarle sobre todo lo que nos ha contado. Parece que no, que les
Gracias.
impresionas muchísimo. Sí, perdón.
Thank you so much for this introductory speech on the history of the Mughal Empire. I was wondering if there's a translation of the Gaburnama into English or not.
Yes, a very good one. One of the edition that I like best, which is an old one done in the 1930s by Annette Beveridge, comes in an Everyman edition, and I wrote the introduction, so you're stuck with me at the front of it, I'm afraid. But it's a very, very, there's this more modern translation by an American scholar called Wheeler Thaxton that's more up to date, but it's less beautiful, the English, and I prefer the old Annette Beveridge one myself, but you can take different attitudes to that. The Beveridge is an interesting, because the daughter of Annette Beveridge created the National Health Service in Britain. It's an interesting side, but a different issue.
Me dicen, sí, perdón.
Very good.
Hi, my name is Akash. What is your interpretation? Like, you being so much into all this history, so what is your interpretation about the Mughals? Do you think they were invaders?
Well, there's no question that they did invade. I mean, the Battle of Panipat is a historical fact. 1526, it happened. And there's no question also that many of the Mughals privileged incomers, so that right through to the 18th century, newly arrived people from Persia and Central Asia were given often important governorships and so on, in preference to local people who could have done so. But as I hope I've shown today, it's a complicated story, and it's not that by 3 generations on, many of them have intermarried, many of them have more Indian blood than Mughal blood, and they never went back. Unlike the English took their money back home to England and built beautiful country houses all over Britain. And so when you go to Britain, particularly my country, Scotland, was one of the very poorest countries in Europe before the East India Company took over India. And in fact, the Scots were so keen to get into the East India Company that the Act of Union in 1707, when England and Scotland join and become the United Kingdom, was predicated on access to the East India Company. And it brings all that they hope for. You find in the century that follows that Scotland pole vaults from sort of 30th in the European League to in the top 5. And all over Scotland you will find beautiful country houses built effectively from loot from India. This is, again, a historical fact. But my lot went back. They also intermarried a fair amount, but they eventually kept to themselves, and in 1947 it was possible for the Brits just to march onto a troop ship and go home. And by the time that I arrived in 1984, there were fewer Brits in India than there had been for 400 years. In contrast, for example, to the French experience in Algeria, where they put down roots, took land, and had to be driven out by a civil war that left 1 million dead. Barely a single Brit died in 1947, although there were many other deaths in 1947 at partition. But the Mughals stayed, and they made it their home, and it's different. So these, like many things in history, these questions have to be approached with nuance, and you have to be aware of the grey areas of history. And people in history are not heroes and villains, gods and demons. They are full of a mix of good and bad, self-interest and charity, good deeds and terrible ones. And that is true of pre-Mughal history as it is of, and post-Mughal history as it is of Mughal history. But I think someone like Akbar, as you said, is a very, very unique figure. But equally, you have the Aurangzebs as well, and both are there. You have to acknowledge both.
Thank you so much, wonderful speakers. Oh, you wanted to say, sí, por favor. And one could only imagine what would have happened if Akbar had met Philip II, who was born here in Valladolid, no? Yes. Yes. Anyway, at least Christopher Columbus died here 500 years ago, and we brought India to the place where he's lying not far away from here. So there's another connection. Thank you so much. This is the first session in Valladolid. Wonderful round of applause to our speakers.